This week in the field, Lbrackets, shooting in Moonlight, and lens flare. It's a Q&A episode. Hey everybody, I'm Scott Davenport and welcome to In the Field. Today's show is a Q&A episode. You've been sending in a bunch of questions over the last few weeks, and I grabbed a few of them, put them together, thought these might be interesting to everyone. Hopefully you find them interesting. If you've got questions about photography, send them my way. You can contact me directly through my website, comments on the video, Twitter, Instagram. I'm in a bunch of places. However you'd like to get a hold of me, I'd love to get your questions. You'll get an answer within a day or two, and your question might be featured on a future episode. With that, let's get into today's stuff. First question's from Paul in the UK, and he asks about Lbrackets. What's good about them? What's bad about them? And are they essential pieces of equipment? Well, if you're unfamiliar with what an Lbracket or an L-plate is, it's a little device, looks like this. And the camera mounts in with this tripod screw. And you've got this vertical side here that wraps around one side of your camera. And usually good ones have a nice big space, so you can still access ports and memory cards and whatever else might be on the side of your camera. So why do we like these? The good stuff, you get one that fits your camera well. It's going to give you a very solid mount between your quick release plate on a ball head and your camera. Now the quick release plate part, this is really, really good. It makes your setup that much faster. Having to thread a screw and screw something in the field, that can become cumbersome, especially if you're chasing light or trying to capture something that's fleeting and you are don't have a lot of time to set up. Having the Lbracket sitting on your camera already, you grab the camera from your bag, pop it on a plate, and then crank a lever on your tripod, and you're set up in a few seconds. The other thing that's nice about having the side part to make the L part of the bracket is you can quickly move between landscape orientation and then portrait orientation. I'll do this a lot for panoramas. I'll shoot in portrait orientation and they just sweep across a scene. And being able to rotate between the two with just a turn of a lever on your ball head and then rotate the camera 90 degrees, clamp it back in, and you're good to go. That's a lot simpler than finding the notch that's in the ball head and rotating things around. Or if you're using one of the tripods that has 2 or 3 different controls for different axes, to me, that's a little more cumbersome, and it tends to shift the center of gravity of your camera in relationship to your tripod. So I know older tripods I've had that weren't as sturdy as the one I use now. That could let the camera either shake more, the tripod would shake more, I was more prone to tipping over. That part of it wasn't so good. Now the bad part about the L plates is usually access to the side of the camera. I've never found one that's been perfect in all situations. Most of the good ones, they'll have this nice big space, actually most anything that's sold now. So you can access ports, you can, have space to be able to connect in remote triggers or intervalometers or anything else you might be connecting to your camera to go use it. And they also usually don't interfere with accessing the battery that might be underneath the camera, wherever your battery gets loaded in. So if you're buying one, make sure you buy one that is, compatible with your camera so that you're not blocking ports or blocking your memory card or your battery, things that you might need to change quickly in the field. You don't want to be fumbling around with taking apart your Lbracket. That kind of defeats the purpose of having one. To answer the question of is it an essential piece of equipment, I'd say that the bottom part, definitely. The vertical part, maybe. It just really depends on your shooting style. If you shoot a fair amount in portrait or you like doing panoramas, I'd say get the extra piece and figure any workarounds that you might need to for port access or cabling. For example, I used to use and still have a wired remote trigger. That's not nearly foolproof. There's no batteries involved. There's no wireless things to fail. Push a button, camera works. But when you have that sticking out through this space here, then you rotate to go in a portrait orientation, there's usually not enough space between your Lbracket bottom and your quick release plate to let that cable come through. So the workaround for that is a wireless trigger. So think about those things. But Paul, hopefully that helps you out. And it was a really good question. Now everyone else knows a lot more about L plates than, well, maybe you really wanted to know. Next question is from Nikki, and she asked, how do I avoid lens flare in long exposures? Okay, well, so Nikki, there's a couple of things that come to mind for this one. The first is, are we using a DSLR or a mirrorless? And this is really a question around an optical viewfinder or an electronic viewfinder. Because one thought I have is, if you're not using a DSLR, you have an optical viewfinder, just covering up the eyepiece with just draping your lens cloth over it or something. Just anything to prevent one more place that light can sneak into your camera while you're doing a long exposure. Now, if you have a mirrorless or an EVF, it's really not an issue. It's electronic. There's no that opening into the camera doesn't affect the optics. Now, the other part of it is, well, what direction are you shooting in? If the sun is at an angle to the camera, you can use your lens hood. That's what it's designed for, to help minimize some of those flares and glares there. You can use the old tried and true method of your hand or your hat, just something that, let's say the sun's coming in this way and I've got my camera here, something to block the direct amount of sun to minimize those flares. But if you're shooting directly into the sun, there's no avoiding lens flare. The better glass that you have will reduce some of that. But there's just a certain point where if you're shooting directly into a light source, you have a stronger potential for getting flare. I notice it more often when I have an ND filter or something, one of the flat square pieces of glass on there. I have to be a little more sensitive to it, or just recognize I'm going to get some flare here and maybe make it part of my shot. So I hope that helps you out, Nikki. Last question is from Paul in the UK. He's asking about shooting in Moonlight and what are some tips or advice to do that. Now, this is different from photographing the moon itself. The moon itself is a sunlit object. The sun is illuminating the moon, and so you treat it like any other subject. Paul's question is more about, you have a scene that is being illuminated by moonlight. The moon may or may not be in your shot. So a few things. If the moon is in the frame and you're shooting the scene that the moon is lighting, you're probably going to be having a long exposure. And so what that means is the moon itself is going to get blurry. As the Earth's rotating, the moon therefore looks like it's moving. It's going to be blurry in the shot. And so that's something to consider, where if the sky has some cloud movement, or there's like the moon's like partially visible, maybe it's fog or mist or something, that can look kind of cool. But if it's just the moon itself and then the moonlight is casting down on the scene, you might think about removing the moon from the frame itself, because otherwise it's going to be this blurry white ball up in the sky and not look so good. Another challenge with shooting a scene just with moonlight is getting a focus point. That can be tough. This is I have a pet peeve about my Sony camera. It doesn't do as good a job as finding a focus point than my Nikon did. That's one thing I miss about my Nikon. But so some things we can do there. One is, if you're able and you have something in the foreground you're focusing on, you can walk up to it with, like I usually take like a little portable flashlight or torch and put it on top of the subject I'm trying to shoot, or angle it so it's lighting up the main subject in my foreground. Do that, get focus lock, and then put the camera into manual focus, remove that light from the scene, and then work the scene the rest of the way. Now, that may not be possible depending on what you're shooting. You may not be able to walk into the scene and light something up. So another thing I'll do is make a very high ISO shot. So 6400, 12 higher than what we would normally do. You can get into 25,000 range, digital snowstorm type thing. But what it will let you see is what's in focus and what isn't. And you don't have to take 2 minutes or 3 minutes or however long your exposure might be just to find out, am I in focus or not? Do that a couple of times and then slowly work the focus ring. That can help. Calculators for hyperfocal distance. These are helpful in these situations. I don't really do hyperfocal distance to a T, but you can look at one of those calculators and say, all right, well, the things in my scene are maybe 5 meters away from me and beyond. And you can kind of start to look at these apps and get an idea of, well, where should my focus be? And if I'm using, let's say, a 24-70 lens and I'm shooting at f11, you'll start to get a range of, well, I'm making this up here, but let's say at 33 millimeters, I'm going to have enough depth of field and enough of my scene in focus that's good enough for me. And you can just dial that in on your lens. You may need to take a couple of test shots and then look on the back of the camera and see, well, where did I end up? Did I get to 33? Was I at 31? Was I at 35? Some lenses have exact markings, others are just a range. So those are a few things that I would say for scenes with Moonlight. After that, all the normal things apply. Pay attention to your composition, what's being lit, what's not being lit, good foreground subject, foreground, midground, background, all the normal things that we do for a landscape photo. That's going to wrap it up for this week in the field. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, please let me know. Again, you can send your questions to me through my website, comments on the video, share this with a friend or your camera club. Any way you can help get the word out about this little show and a little corner of the internet we share would be great. And until next time, my name's Scott Davenport. Happy shooting. Our last question is from Paul in the UK. I think the same Paul that asked the first question. Why two Pauls? Well, three would be too many.